Okay, folks, new Know Your Fantasy video is go. This has to be the most requested subject for this series. So let's talk about my favorite D&D race, the stocky subterranean dwarf. Hi, I'm Tristan Johnson, and this is Step Back History. Be sure to click the subscribe button as well as the bell notification to never miss a new Step Back video or live stream. The word dwarf, not surprisingly, comes from Old English. The word dwerg, which had cousins in various Germanic languages like Norse and High German, they all hail from a Proto-Germanic word, that one. Beyond its source, though, what the word means seems to be still up for grabs. Some linguists think dwarves might be nature spirits associated with death, or even have roots to far-off Sanskrit demons called Dwarves. Semantics aside, dwarves have their origins in Scandinavian mythology. In the 13th century, we have recordings of dwarves in Norse poetry. For example, in the poem Volslup. For example, in that poem, the Norse legend about dwarves is that they came from the blood of the giant Brimir and the bones of the giant Björn. However, scholars think that these are just different spellings for the mythological character Ymir. In true Norse fashion, dwarves are a sort of maggot infesting Ymir's flesh before the gods gave them sentience. Some poems claim dwarves held up the sky, other myths cast them as muses inspiring works of poetry or as lusty monsters who hounded the female goddesses. In the Ynglinga saga, they get their first reference as metal workers and associate them with living in the mountains, or at the bottom of mines and with death. One apparently was set to marry Thor's daughter, but when exposed to sunlight, turned to stone. You can also throw in a bunch of associations from Norse mythology about elves, so go see my elf video to complete the story, as they cross over quite a bit. Often dwarves were merely called black elves. After Christianization, things began to change. It's not until this period dwarves were even referred to as short. They were lesser beings, but not till this period did that turn into literal smallness. Dwarves were usually depicted as small, about 18 inches tall or so, ugly, and with big beards. There appears to be very few references to lady dwarves. They lived in the mountains with their own tribes, kings, chieftains, and armies. Their subterranean halls filled with gold and treasure. They could even see the future and create magical items. They were kind, but angry when betrayed. Like with my discussion on elf arrows in my elf video, dwarves also seem to appear in Anglo-Saxon medical texts. They were thought to be the cause of insomnia. Some scholars suspect the Old English word for dwarf might be the root of the term nightmare, which was the medical word for a fever. Scholars have a whole bunch of theories as to how dwarves came about in mythology. Some suspect the dwarves as smiths and living in the mountains is a distant cultural memory of Stone Age people. However, one exciting theory might be my favorite. People who worked in mines might have had a propensity for shortness. Mining throughout European history was a specialized and capital-intensive craft. Often miners would develop a culture, law, and jargon all their own as they guarded their trade secrets. They'd teach it to their children, but not to strangers, and this would pass down through generations. Now, just like chimney sweeping, the shorter you are, the better when it comes to mining. Before dynamite, the wider a tunnel was, the more expensive it would be to maintain. So it would be twice as expensive to make a tunnel for somebody 6 feet tall rather than someone 4 feet tall. So the tall children were probably encouraged to find a different line of work, even leaving the mining colony. This would result in a sort of natural selection effect. So if you ran into a colony of tiny miners with their own language and were very secretive, you might develop some myths about them. So let's bring this to modern times. The dwarf we know today came into prominence through the Grimm fairy tales. Snow White and her 7 roommates. Disney picked it up and the rest is cinematic history. Then we come to the almost unavoidable section where we talk about J.R.R. Tolkien. This is one of the first texts which distinguishes dwarves from elves. Much of what we think about dwarves is from Tolkien's amalgamation of mythology and his own world building. There are 2 ways to pluralize dwarf. Dwarves with a V or dwarfs with an F. The former becoming famous because of a grammar mistake by J.R.R. Tolkien that he decided to just roll with afterwards. There's also a discussion amongst Tolkienists, yes, a real field of literary studies, that addresses one problem that comes up in Tolkien's work. You see, Tolkien himself went on a lengthy discussion about how his dwarves were astonishingly like the Jews, a nod to the pretty common anti-Semitism of his period. Remember, as the Dark Mother says, you can critique the problematic aspects of a piece of media and still enjoy it. The more you know. And of course, we come to the world of gaming. Dwarves feature prominently in Dungeons & Dragons. Gary Gygax took those black elves, thought to be dwarves, and made them their own subspecies of elf called the drow. And now in most games, having dwarves around is pretty symbolic there's gonna be some fantasy going down. What I'd be curious about is why in some of these worlds, dwarves are extinct, like in the Elder Scrolls series or Warhammer 40k. If you have a guess about that, leave it in the comments. There we go, the dwarf, an icon of the fantasy genre and lots of fun for years to come. For sure my favorite D&D race. What should I tackle next in this series? Type it up in the comments after you call me a nasty word. I gotta finish this with a plug for the D&D series on Twitch I perform in as a player every Wednesday night. It's called Tales from the Sanguine Isles. And I actually in it play a drunk karate dwarf. At least for the moment. It's very likely I'm going to die next week. So if you want to see what crazy shenanigans we get up to, go to twitch.tv/dungeon_dwellers and cheer us on. This video was made possible by these hard workers, as well as the rest of my patrons over at Patreon. I'd especially like to thank Don and Carrie Johnson, as well as Colbine Mani, for their generosity. The theme song is by 12 Tone, and come back next time for more Step Back.